Grand earth has quaked before, moved by the sound of his voice, and seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken from my regard. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you. It is well with me. Be it for me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see, and this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you. It is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. Waves and winds still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. Waves and winds still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. Waves and winds still know His name. Waves and winds still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
Hello and welcome. My name is Pastor Dave. Thank you for joining us. We are in week 2 of our sermon series called Keep Your Receipts. And what this is we're looking at how do we memorialize the work God is doing in our life? What are some practical things and what did people in Scripture do to remember their encounters with God? And so we are posting some extra stuff on Facebook during this month, so be sure and check that out. Now, in review, what is a receipt? Right? We when we go shopping, we all get receipts, so we kind of know, but it's a proof of transaction. It's a record of date and price, and they serve more purposes than just that. But just a receipt is this record that is kept. And so in our relationship with God, we want to keep receipts. We want to remember the things that He has done and is doing. Now, last week we talked about the character of Noah and Noah in the ark, and we talked about how the world at that time was all villains and no heroes, right? And so God brought judgment, and then out of that, God, of course, made a covenant with Noah that would serve between him and Noah, but would serve for all generations. And He sent the rainbow, His rainbow, as a reminder of that covenant. So we have this permanent reminder of that work of God every time we see a rainbow. Now, we're still in the book of Genesis, and we are looking at a different character. So Genesis 28, we're going to look at the character of Jacob. Now, his story spans the second half of the book of Genesis. His story spans 20-some chapters. It's one of those characters where we have a really full picture of who he was, bigger than, we have more about him than a lot of other characters in Scripture. So it's a big story. We're not going to read the whole thing. If you want to, you can start Genesis is 50 chapters, and you can kind of start almost in the middle of Genesis and start to pick up his story. And then his story is going to kind of weave through the whole second half of the book of Genesis. And he will be central for part of that. And then his kids will take kind of a central portion of that. But then he'll be reintroduced as he's a really old man later on. And so you can read all about him if you want. We're going to look at just a portion. So Genesis 28, 10 through 22. Let me read that to you. Jacob left Beersheba and went to Haran. He came to a certain place and camped for the night since the sun had set. He took one of the stones there, set it under his head, and lay down to sleep. And he dreamed. A stairway was set on the ground, and it reached all the way to the sky. Angels of God were going up and going down on it. Now, just to kind of set the tone of what's happening is he is still kind of a young man at this point in his story, and he is taking this journey, and he's traveling to a different land to look for opportunity, to look for a girl to marry. And so he's on this journey to kind of start his adult life, to get married, to just branch out on his own. So that's what he's doing. Then God was right before him, saying, I am God, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. I'm giving the ground on which you are sleeping to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be as the dust of the earth. They'll stretch from west to east and from north to south. All the families of the earth will bless themselves in you and your descendants. Yes, I'll stay with you. I'll protect you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this very ground. I'll stick with you until I've done everything I promised you. Jacob woke up from his sleep. He said, God is in this place, truly, and I didn't even know it. He was terrified. He whispered in awe, incredible, wonderful, holy. This is God's house. This is the gate of heaven. Jacob was up first thing in the morning. So this, he's traveling, he goes down to sleep for the night, and he has this encounter with God. and God kind of reveals himself, and God reaffirms the promise that God had made to both his father and grandfather. And so now he wakes up in the morning. Jacob was up first thing in the morning. He took the stone that he had used for his pillow and stood it up as a memorial stone and poured oil over it. He christened the place Bethel, which means God's house. The name of the town had been Luz until then. Jacob vowed a vow. If God stands by me and protects me on this journey on which I'm setting out, keeps me in food and clothing, and brings me back in one piece to my father's house, this God will be my God. This stone that I have set up as a memorial stone will mark this place where God lives. And everything you give me, I'll return a tenth to you. So, Jacob starts on this journey. He goes to sleep, has this encounter with God. He wakes up in the middle of the night after this encounter, and God reaffirming his covenant that he had made with Jacob's grandfather, and he reaffirms it and says, I'm still going to keep these promises, and I'm going to continue to work within your family line to keep these promises. And Jacob, for what seems to be like the first time in his life where he really has this encounter with God, and his life is beginning to take a turn at this point. So who was he? Now you could go back and read the few chapters prior to this story, and we get a different picture of who Jacob is. Like, he's a liar. He's a trickster. He's a deceiver. He's selfish. He took advantage of his brother for the family birthright, and that's a big deal in that culture. He then, as his father is old and going to bless the first, Jacob wasn't the firstborn. His brother Esau was the firstborn, and so the birthright goes to the firstborn son, and a certain special blessing goes to the firstborn son. And so Jacob barely missed out on those things, not being the firstborn son. And so his character is such that he went ahead and deceived his father and pretended to be his brother at his mother's urging. So this is a whole family mess. And he lies to his father and pretends to be his brother, and basically deceives his father and steals the blessing from his brother, right? This is the character of Jacob at this point in his life. He in a little while after the story we read, he's going to repeat some of the same mistakes that his grandfather made concerning how to manage a house and have a wife and bear children. He's going to make some of the same mistakes. He is at times, he is a coward. When it comes to picking his wife, we see that he valued outward beauty more than character. And you can read that story if you want. And so he's not the best guy. And so it is this thing where it seems strange that God chooses to work through him. There at a church I used to be at, there was a farmer, and he had this phrase that I heard him say it a couple times, and I just love it. He said, "There is more corn in a crooked row." Now I know very little about farming and corn and whether that's actually precise. Is there more corn in a crooked row? I don't know for sure, but he would just kind of joke around and say that. And the phrase it has stuck with me because I see, whether it's true or not in the field, I don't know, but I see that at times in Scripture, God chooses to work with people who are a bit crooked. Jacob is a perfect example of this. And God chooses to reveal himself to Jacob and work in and through Jacob. And the end result is Jacob's going to become a central figure for the Israelite nation, because they're going to bear his namesake. Like, God is going to change Jacob's name to Israel. And so the Israelites get their name from Jacob. It's going to be his 12 sons will become the 12 tribes of Israel. And we see God work in Jacob, this guy who's kind of crooked, and turn his life into something amazing. And so this idea that there's more corn in a crooked row, I don't know if it's true in the field, but what I see is with God working in the life of Jacob, he takes this kind of crooked man and turns him into something amazing. See, God works with the unworthy. I don't know if you have ever felt unworthy. It seems to be a common thing that we go through where we don't feel worthy of God's grace. We don't feel worthy of God asking us to do something for him. We feel like there's better people. We're always comparing ourselves, like this person has more giftings, or this person, they're really righteous, or their character is better than mine, or they have this or that, and I just feel unworthy. Like, why would God want to use me? I'm not special like they are, or I don't have the same gifts, or I haven't done the same things, or I don't come from that family, but you can kind of throw most of that out, because when you look at Scripture, you see that God often chooses people who are unworthy. And that's who he chooses to work with. I don't understand it. I don't get why he picks some of the people he picks. Like, I kind of scratch my head and I'm like, well, why would you choose Jacob? Like, I understand that you made a promise to his grandfather and the covenant stuff, but man, could you move another generation down maybe? Like, this guy is crooked. But God works with the unworthy. And he's done it. There's a story in Luke chapter 5 where Jesus is kind of first assembling his disciples. And it's this, you've read the story before where some of them are out fishing and Jesus tells them to, cast your line, and they're like, we worked hard all night and there ain't no fish in this water. And Jesus is like, no, do this, and they do it, and all of a sudden, the nets were so full of fish that the nets began to tear. Like, it was this really cool miracle in their life. And in Luke 5, starting in verse 8, it says, when Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "O Lord, please leave me. I'm such a sinful man." For he was awestruck by the number of fish they had caught, as were the others with him. And Jesus chose Peter at that point in time. And Peter is going to then follow Jesus. But Peter's first reaction is, I'm not worthy. I'm not, Jesus, do yourself a favor and go pick somebody better. But Jesus is like, no, I work with the unworthy. I reveal myself to those who don't deserve it. I will bless those who can't earn it. I will give grace to those who shouldn't deserve it. Like, that's what God does. And so if you feel unworthy, you're in good company. You are exactly the type of people that I see God choose over and over and over again. Peter's first thought is, I'm too big of a sinner. Like, Jesus, you don't know who you're picking. But a few years down the road, Peter is going to be there when Pentecost happens, and then he's going to be preaching to thousands of people, and he is going to spark a revival and be kind of the leader of the early church. Like, that is Peter, who at first was like, I'm a huge mess up, Jesus. You don't want to pick me. But Jesus picked him anyway. And when Peter surrendered to Jesus, it transformed his life. So if you feel unworthy, If you feel like you are too much of a mess up, if you feel like you aren't qualified, if you feel like you don't know enough, if you feel like you've made too many mistakes in the past, if you feel like you don't come from the right family line, if you haven't learned enough, if you don't read the Bible enough, if you've never prayed enough, if you feel any of those things, you know what? You're just like the people that God chooses to work with over and over and over again. I don't understand it. It doesn't necessarily make sense. Maybe it's true. There is more corn in a crooked row. So one of the things that Jacob had to learn, I think, is that he couldn't go through life looking backwards. Right? We all have things in our past that it's not that we shouldn't deal with our past, and there are definitely points when we do have to go back and work through some of that stuff, for certain. But we can't live in the past. We can't stay there. We can't always keep an eye in the past if that prevents us from going forward. See, forward is the most important gear. Right? If you drive a car, how often do you go drive to visit somebody and you do the whole drive in neutral? Right? You can't unless you're pushing the car. How often do you drive across town in reverse? Probably not very often. I had this when I was youth pastoring years ago. There was this guy in our youth group, and I think it was his first car, and he bought one of those Saabs. Is it Swedish? I don't even know what country they come from, but he had this car, and it was a manual transmission, and they're kind of a small car, and shortly after he got it, the transmission dropped the reverse gear, and so he didn't have reverse. The car would drive in the forward gears, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it wouldn't shift into reverse. And so imagine having a car where you can't put it in reverse. What do you do when you pull into a parking spot? And then you pull in forward. What happens when you gotta back out? And so and this is, he's a teenager at this point. You do what you have to do, and there are times when we'd help him push he could have his door open, and he could put it in neutral, and he could use his foot in the car, because it's not a big car, he could kind of work his way and kind of get some momentum and get it pushed out of a parking spot and then put it in forward and go. And I remember times giving him a little push out of his parking spot because the reverse gear didn't work. We can't dwell on the past. Jacob couldn't live in the past. Do you have to deal with it sometimes? Sure. But you can't let the past be such a hindrance to you that it doesn't allow you to put the gear in forward and go. And if Jacob had dwelled, if he had lived in the past, he would have never become the man that he would eventually become. Because his past was not great. He was all of those things. He was a liar. He was a deceiver. That was his character back then. But as God worked in his life, as God revealed himself, he began to transform Jacob into a new person. And Jacob couldn't look at the past and let that determine who he would be in the future. He had to move forward. It's better to stay on the merry-go-round rather than deconstructed, right? As Jacob, and let me explain that, as Jacob moved forward, and as God revealed himself in the story we read, and he'll have several more encounters with God, he began to, it grew a faith in Jacob of who God was, and Jacob made vows. He made clear vows to follow God and how he would follow God. But then what would happen is life would become difficult. Life would get hard. He would be, and ironically, he would be treated how he treated others in his past. And he would go and he would get married and be mistreated by his wives' father who he worked for, and he would change his wages, and this whole story of mistreatment. And life would become these seasons of difficulty for Jacob. And at that point, Jacob had to make a choice. And the choices he makes, they mirror a lot of what we go through. See, Jacob, when he's younger, he encounters God and he makes these promises to God. God, I'm going to follow you. God, I'm going to do this for you. I'm chasing after you, God. And many of us have had encounters with God in our childhood or our teenage years where we make these vows to God. And then what happens when we run into adulthood? Life gets hard. We get mistreated. People abandon us. All of these things happen. And oftentimes, what we do is we are deciding, now do I stay on this merry-go-round or do I hop off it? Like I was following God, do I get out of this life and because it doesn't feel like God's being faithful, or it doesn't feel like God's really got my back in this, or it doesn't feel like God is providing for me. Life is hard, life is difficult. And we have to choose, are we going to stay on that merry-go-round? Are we going to keep going around and round with this and keep holding on to our faith? Or are we going to get off? There's this thing that kind of how we describe it, I guess, has been how more recently talk about deconstructing our faith. And people have always wrestled through the faith of their childhood or the faith of their parents. We've always had a bit of that, but now we've kind of put different terms on it, I think, and talk about deconstructing our faith. And you can read articles about it. Overall, I don't think that it's always a positive thing. Like it's the premise of how we get there sometimes is off. Like anyway, I'm not going to get too much into it, but this idea that we should just start over and really find out what's true now that we're older. Well, what's wrong with that is in a relationship, there isn't really a reset. Like if you were following God as a teenager and you made vows and promises to God, you can't say, God, let's cancel all of that so that I can start over and see if you're really real. It doesn't really work like that. And so what I encourage you to do is do what Jacob did. Instead of throwing everything out and saying, I'm going to start over, lean into the promises that you had made to God when you were younger. Are we going to wrestle through our faith in life? Sure. Remember the vows that you made. Remember the promises. Remember the encounters you had with God. And let those things be your guide. Let those things give you the energy to keep going when times are tough. See, God remembers his promises. Let's remember ours. Jacob had this encounter with God, and he made these promises to God. God, if you are faithful to me, this is what I'm going to do. If you help me in this journey, this is what I'm going to do. And then Jacob goes on in that journey, and life gets really hard. At times, he's going to be deceived. He's going to fear for his life. He's going to have these situations come about where life is just difficult for him. And he has to choose to either remember his promises he made to God or walk away from them. And he chooses to remember them. And he chooses to continue even through hard times. He seems to keep following God. And God's going to reveal himself to Jacob in some really cool ways later on in his life. And Jacob is going to be transformed into Israel and kind of the father of the Israelite nation in many ways. But I think that happens because Jacob remembers the promises he made to God and he doesn't abandon them. What are the things that you promised God when you first met him? Maybe you were a kid or a teenager or a young adult. Maybe you were in a difficult situation and you said, God, if you will help me through this, I will follow you. Go back to those promises. Remember them. Keep those vows. So what did he really promise to God when he had that dream and he woke up? What did he really do? Let's go back and look at it. Jacob vowed a vow. If God stands by me and protects me on this journey on which I'm setting out, keeps me in food and clothing, and brings me back in one piece to my Father's house, which if you read all the way through, God does. This God will be my God. This stone that I have set up as a memorial pillar will mark this place as a place where God lives. And everything you give me, I'll return 1/10 to you. So what was Jacob's vow? What was his promise? He promised to make God God in his life, to keep God as God in his life. He set up the stone now. The marker stone, that's important to have memorials like that, but you know what? Jacob is going to get up that day and continue on his journey, and he's not going to see that stone very often in his life. Not for decades in between, probably. He may have gone back and encountered it again. But what is his promise? What is his ongoing vow he makes? Everything you give me, I will return 1/10 to you. See, Jacob set up this system in his life where he was going to, on a weekly or monthly basis, evaluate the blessings God had given him and return 1/10. That's incredible. We need to be like Jacob. We need to, in our life, develop a rhythm where we are constantly evaluating how God is providing for us and giving back 1/10 of that. Now, you may think that how typical the church is talking about tithing. Well, I want to tell you that that's not, when I started preparing for this message, that wasn't my intent. I didn't think this is where this would end up. But as I stuck to the story, that is where this ends up. But it's not, I don't think it's just like this isn't to like give money to the church. This is, are you in your life? Are you sitting down with your spouse? And are you guys looking over the ways God has blessed you over the prior weeks or month? And are you asking yourself the question, if God has done this in our life, how do we give back? And that, of course, will be, in part, that'll involve money. That's the culture we live in. We work for paychecks, right? We God blesses through financial means. That's part of it. But what are the other things that God is doing in your life? Is God giving you grace? Is God showing you forgiveness? Do you have time? Has He blessed you with time? Has He blessed you with good health? With talents? Maybe you love to cook and host people. How has God poured blessings into your life? Sit down as a family and discuss this. How has God blessed us this month? And how do we give back? And it's not about writing a check. It may involve that at points. But how do you give back grace? How do you give back forgiveness? Maybe there are times you need to give ears, right? Sit down and listen to somebody. Maybe you need to give tears, right? Maybe you need to cry with somebody and help them through a time of grief in their life because God has blessed you and brought you through a time like that? How do you give energy, time, mercy, compassion? How do you give back? Jacob made this vow to God that he would return 1/10 of everything God blessed him with. So I think giving is keeping. We're talking about keeping receipts. How do we remember and memorialize the things God is doing in our life? Giving is keeping. When we spend time on a weekly or monthly basis where we look at the ways God has blessed us, and then we figure out how do we give 1/10 of that. When we learn to do that, when we learn to give, when we develop that rhythm in our life, we will be keeping receipts. Because when you have those conversations and you figure out, sometimes creatively, how do I give back? Those times of giving back are going to be huge reminders in your life of what God is doing. So I challenge you. Sit down with your family this week. Make a list. How has God blessed you? And how can you give back 1/10 of that? Giving is keeping.